Okay, so there was an archaeologist who went out, Art Johnson, who went out in the 1970s, and he has a sketch map, and he shows where the barn was. The barn was down at that time, but he figured out where the foundation of one of the barns was. And in that area, so we know basically where that was, but there's been a lot of landscaping since then. So there's, if you look at the landscape fortunately where the Powell, that landscaping sort of stopped where their house was, but just to the north of that, there's a berm like about probably 5 or 6 feet. So and you know how rural places are, people throw trash over, so you might be able to find that, but I suspect that it's probably under that berm. The other problem that we've had out there is it's really wet because um, the town sort of channeled the water from when they made the rail trail onto that property, and it sort of made the low area kind of a swamp. And I think that's where the barn was. But I've walked out across most of that, and it's not visible on the surface. And where Art Johnson has, it's farther. It would be up on the upland where they've made.
Okay. From my past experience with family that had dairy barns, what you want to do is you want to look for a spring near the barn, because if they're doing milk cows, they'll generally have either a spring barn where they flow the water in through the bottom of the barn, and they leave the cans of milk actually in the water to keep it refrigerated before the advent of refrigeration. And if you have that huge cellar on the side of that addition to the house, if there's a spring on one end and a channel through that, that may be where they were storing the milk.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of our idea, because there's a to the back of the cellar, there's actually a pond there now, because the way that they pushed the soil, but there was a natural drainage that came through there, and there's a spring head up at the top. So their well was above that, and then below that would have been right at the back of the cellar. So
yeah, that sounds exactly the way I've seen it set up. I had a cousin. We used to go visit my grandfather up in Maine, and you go over the hill, and you'd have to bring your glass jugs, and they would take the ladle and open up the 35-gallon milk can by pulling it through the water, flip it open, and take a ladle, and with a funnel fill up your glass milk jug. So
yeah.
and he had a couple hundred of these 35-gallon milk cans floating in there as he milked the cows.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, anybody else? Oh, from the Mets fan. Got
Hi, my question is about marriage records. In the early 19th century, is who's keeping marriage, or just churches, or because the state of New York really wasn't pushing recording? How are they recording marriages?
So the ones that I found are from the Dutch Reformed Church. So though, and the nice thing there again, so the earliest ones I found were from about, I think maybe the earliest one might be 1819, 1815, somewhere in there. But the nice thing is you get the maiden name. So then you can start really tying some of the families together. And so what I did was I created a database of about 300 and some names, 380 names, I think now, for Bethlehem. And all the children, and by doing that, you can start to see, okay, this person was born in this year, and they were married in this year, and okay, they belong to this family, and oh, really, they're a Thompson. So then I can put down what their maiden name was. So you can't get that information from census data, but you can from the church records. So that's what I've used. But Paul might have have you used other sources for marriage?
No, the marriage record that I used was the one that's published by the Dutch Reformed Church in Albany. From the Dutch Reformed Church of Albany is a single volume published by originally by the Holland Society of New York, and then it was reprinted by the Baltimore Genealogical Publishing Company. But that volume is the key to the marriages all through the 18th century in Albany County, Rensselaer County. It's an extremely important source. I think we all probably have used it.
And the other thing I'll mention, like occasionally in the 18th century, you'll see like a marriage between servant of somebody and their a servant of somebody else. So you do see records of enslaved people married in the church, but it's not as common before, from my experience, before 1815.
Okay, I know we have some online questions. Oh, we have another question here.
You mentioned Bach Corners. Is the property at Bach Corners, the current Bach Corners, what they call Bach Corners?
Corners
Yeah, so
north of it.
yeah, it's north. So the Powell farmstead is north. So if you go up Route 9, it's north of that.
I have friends that live just above Bach Road or whatever they call that, on Route 9 on the northeast corner. It's currently called Crump's Diesel. So I wondered if that was part of their property, and it's kind of an extensive piece of property too.
Yeah, I don't think that
They're still there.
That's too far to the south, but I will say that so since Bot Corners, and so that's like the northern line of Rensselaer.
Well, yeah, the Bott Corners is the junction of Bott Road and Route 9.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that little hamlet stands on the boundary line between Rensselaerswyck to the south and open land to the north. It was Rensselaer had only the property south of Bott Road. There's a section of Bott Road that runs east and west, and that connects with Manor Avenue in Cohoes, which goes right down to Cohoes Falls. So that combination of Manor Avenue and Bott Road is the original north line of Rensselaerswyck. There was a neighborhood was called Bott that was in the bend of the Mohawk River, but that neighborhood that was called the Bott actually extended into Rensselaerswyck, extended south of the Manor line as far as 99 Johnson Road, which is within Rensselaerswyck. So the entire neighborhood was called the Bott at one time, not just the present day Bott Corners.
Okay, thank you.
I will tell you one more thing about that. So yeah, as Paul said, north of that, that's where like the Fondas and the Lansings, they were able to get that land. Well, the Vandenbergs were there first, but then they were able to get that land from the Vandenbergs, and so right at the corner there, where there's like a pizza place there. So if you go left on Bott Road, or if you just go left a little ways, there's some new houses there. There used to be one of those farmsteads was right there. Albert Thompson had a house right there. And I don't know if it's where those new houses are, but it's right. It would have been right in that area.
Okay, we have two in the chat box. The first one is from Melissa, and I think it was originally directed at Paul because it was during your presentation, Paul. And what she said is, how accessible are the records you're using in the New York State Library? Can the public view these maps and the original documents?
The New York State Library, fortunately, has a very large collection of the Rensselaer papers, the Rensselaer family, and I think it's called the Rensselaerswyck papers. I'm not sure what the name of the collection is, but it's a wonderful treasure that they have, as much as they do have. A lot of it was destroyed originally in the 1911 fire, but somehow after 1911 they acquired a huge collection of Rensselaer leases for Rensselaerswyck farms. So the lease holdings that the state library has are listed in a finding aid that is available online. You can actually look at a list of all the leases that they own. And these are the original documents, not just transcriptions, but they're the original leases that were signed by Stephen Vermenschelier. Most of them date from the 1780s and 90s. So the really early ones are missing, but without the leases that the state library has, we would really be in trouble in terms of tracing Rensselaerswyck farms. The other record besides the leases are the rent books. They have all the books and ledgers of recording the rent receipts from tenant farmers. And those are very important because they tell you just how long the farms were occupied by a given family. And of course, the rent books start out with the original leaseholder, but then they change over to the next owner, which could be somebody else entirely. So they record the change in title according to the number of people paying rent. It's a fantastic resource, and the third source that they have are the actual manor maps, the maps that were surveyed by John E. Van Allen. And one of them is dated 1788. The state library has the maps that were turned over by the Rensselaer family, including the map. There's a map of Nassau, town of Nassau, which dates probably about 1800, but the map of Schodack is a lot earlier than 1800. What's interesting also is that the Schodack map that the state library has is not actually the original. The original Schodack map by Van Allen, miraculously, is preserved in the county archives. And that map is really, really important because that's the original Van Allen map that was dated 1788, and it actually shows the locations of houses. Each house is shown on each farm, which is wonderful for archaeology to locate sites. The map that's in the state library does not show the houses. It's the same map with the same farms, the same names, but the map in the state library does not have the house locations. So that's a little tidbit to remember in researching Schodack farms. So I think the three sources that the state library has are the lease maps, the actual leases, and thirdly, the manor registers of rent receipts. And there's also a book of farm surveys. Each page of the book is a separate farm survey map drawn by John E. Van Allen. And one of the maps I showed you today is from that book of lease maps. The book of maps of leases contains a description of the farm, the survey field notes, plus the map actually of the boundary of the farm. So that's another source that they have. It's wonderful what they have.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul. We did get a second question, and this was from Dave. This question came in during Mike's presentation, but I think it probably applies to both of you. And the question is, have any of the archaeological finds at any of these sites provided evidence of ethnic or cultural expression? In other words, is there a material culture at these sites that is the same or different as we look at evidence of their cultural differences? So, Mike, I'll have you go first.
Cultural difference. So I would say in the case of like Thomas Powell, the Powell family farmstead, I would say probably not, just because most of the artifacts we have are mass-produced artifacts. So even the early stuff is so you have like ceramics that are going to be the same kind of ceramics you're going to find anywhere, creamware, some of the stuff that Paul was talking about, shell edge, pearlware, and so on. I think so individual artifacts is you might see some differences in terms of the foodways. So you might see differences that you'd have to compare it with other farmsteads and see if the Powells were different in terms of what they were cooking versus another, like say a white farm assemblage. The one thing that there was an interesting artifact that we found that was it was part of a case bottle, so it was like a square bottle, but it was just a fragment of it, and it was kind of so they're square, so it was just like the angle of it like that, and it was about this big, and it was worked on one edge for a tool, and it was deliberately worked. So it's probably an earlier artifact from the site that was worked, because they didn't have as much material, and it's an expedient tool. You can take a piece of bottle glass and make it into a cutting thing. So that has shown up on other African American sites in the area. North, there's a site up in Malta where they found this worked glass, and it's probably an aspect though also of just not having a lot of stuff available and very very limited material culture, and you're going to use it in whatever way you can. The other thing in that sense, and I don't know if this is, it's probably nothing cultural. It's probably just the fact that things are in short supply. When the railroad came through, it was right in front of the Powell, not right in front of the house, but pretty close. And so we found quite a few railroad spikes, and actually quite a few that it looks like they've been used as chisels or some other kind of tool. So the top has been cut off on some of these, and then you can see where they've actually used them as tools. So you see that as well. But as far as like the overall assemblages, you have to really look at it in combination with everything versus another site. You know what I mean? Not just individual artifacts.
Okay, Paul?
I think what's interesting is that if you compare the sites, the 4 sites that I talked about, 2 of them were fractured between loyalist sons and loyal American soldiers who were joining the militia. The Dusenberry father was alienated from the son, and the Gaylor father and brother were alienated from another brother. So that's kind of an interesting pattern. All of these different tenants were soldiers in the militia of Albany County in the Revolutionary War. And what's interesting also is that 2 of them had terrible experiences that might have converted them to become militia members. Martin Gaylor's brother was hung as a spy, and he probably had to witness that execution. So that apparently turned him into a militia member in the American Army. And the other one, of course, was the Orlop, who was originally a loyalist, witnessed a horrible massacre at Cherry Valley, and came back and left Cherry Valley, came to Albany County, and eventually became a member of the militia. And then at 2 of their sites, we just happened to have pieces of clay pipes that had patriotic symbols on them. So there are interesting patterns to be studied between these different sites in comparing similarities and differences.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to hand this back to Dave, and if there are other questions in the audience, now is the time.
Ellen, all right. Alrighty, Ellen.
Okay, I'm just curious, in the research that you did on the African American families, did you find any examples of them being children of the original owners that enslaved them, and or did you find any examples of racial intermarriage?
Okay, so the answer to the last question is no. The first question, because okay, so with the marriages are always, all the marriages are between other African American families. So it's the Thompsons, and there's so you see founding member in the 1830s, especially. You see all these founding surnames. So that's when you're getting some surnames, so you can kind of trace it. And so the marriages are taking place between those families, not just in like if you take South Bethlehem, not just in Bethlehem and Queens, but also in Troy. So you see families, and you see that in Watervliet, obviously, as well. You see people moving over to Troy. You see people moving back from Troy, finding marriage partners over in Troy. So you see that, but not a lot of intermarriage between white and black families. What was this? Oh, it's the second question about the children. So we have found actually a child's tea set, or at least part of one, maybe two pieces of these little cups, a couple of marbles, the early clay marbles, um, and but not a lot of toys, I would say. But we have found a couple of early things, like I said, the teaware and the little teacups and the marble, but not a lot else in terms of toys.
Let me ask the question a little differently. So I guess I was wondering, in other cases where slave owners have left property to some of their enslaved individuals, in some cases they've actually been their children.
Hmm.
That's what I'm wondering is in these cases, some of them were freed and then they were given property after the slave owner died. So did you find any instance that any of them were actually children, any of the people who were enslaved were actually children of the original owner of the property or the slaveholder?
No. I mean, that doesn't mean that obviously that happened. But I haven't at this point been able to find any evidence of that. And there again, I'm mostly going from a point where we have surnames and we can sort of, so what I really wanted to find out originally was just, okay, we know that people were enslaved, but like where did they go, and how, did they stay around, and sort of what happened with their lives after that point. So there is an opportunity to sort of go back farther, but it gets a lot harder. And the stuff you're talking about is really difficult to get to. And I just haven't found any evidence of that. I mean, it happened, we know, right? So, but in this case, I haven't been able to find it.
Some of these sites may have already been settled by Native Americans. You'd have to go deeper underground, though, to find any evidence of that, or did you run across any Native American evidence in your work?
So for me, like a Powell, no. There's we haven't found as much as a flake, from a stone tool or anything like that. But certainly I mean, every site there's a potential for that, because if somebody was living there, that was probably a good place to live. So if you're close to a spring head, or you're close to a ravine, or places of settlement, they're there for a reason. So a lot of times you find earlier habitation. But Paul, you might be able to speak to that.
There was an extensive prehistoric occupation at the Orlap site in the town of Colony. And the report on the Orlap site turns out it was a very informative and significant late prehistoric site. Nothing to do with the Orlap family, but they just happened to settle at the same location as the Indians had a very large, extensive occupation, probably a couple thousand years ago. I mean, it was late archaic, I think, occupation at the Orlap site. At the other sites, no, there's not anything prehistoric or Indian related at all that I can remember. Just the Orlap site is outstanding from that standpoint, though. It's where the state police headquarters is now located. Yeah, unfortunately.